Welcome to the She-cession panel, How COVID-19 is Killing Gender Diversity. My name is Ehren Lee. I'm a partner with the consulting firm Urban Systems. We are honored and humbled to sponsor this panel. We believe that our communities make better choices with different voices at the table. COVID has affected some voices a lot more than others, and we think our economic challenges will be more acute. Recovery will be tougher unless we can shine a light on these setbacks and learn from them. This panel is one way, and an important way, to encourage conversation that helps us understand the uneven impacts from the pandemic and to learn from our experiences so that we can come up with better ways to support diversity in our communities. And these supports should stem from the here and now, but also contribute to a stronger workforce, better community decisions, and a more prosperous economy for the long term. We, Urban, want to be an ally in making conditions better for all of us. So thanks again to SIP for making this issue a focus area during Rising Economy Week. And thanks to you for joining this conversation. This session is a part of Rising Economy Week, an immersive week-long virtual event co-hosted by the South Island Prosperity Partnership and Pacific Northwest Economic Region. I would like to pass the panel off to our moderator, Starr McMichael, President of Starrboard Enterprises.
Thanks, Ehren, very much, and welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the She-cession, How COVID-19 is Killing Gender Diversity, which is a rather cute term for a frightening prospect. The pressures of COVID-19 have hit women disproportionately hard. 1/3 of working mothers in Canada have thought about quitting their jobs during the novel coronavirus pandemic, according to a recent national survey. The survey, conducted by Polaris Strategic Insights for the Prosperity Project, found the weight of homemaking, childcare, and schooling during the COVID-19 lockdown fell disproportionately on women. And many who were also juggling professional responsibilities thought about leaving their jobs. Similarly, in the USA, 1 in 4 women are reducing hours or leaving the workforce due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our panel discusses why women's advancement is backsliding, the serious impact of the She-cession, and how we can all do our part to help create greater economic social equity. It is now my honor to introduce this panel, and if I read their full bios, we'd be here for a week, but I do urge you to go to the conference website. It's fair to say that the organizers have convened a veritable brain trust here to discuss this important topic. So I'll introduce, if I may, Tina Strehlke, as CEO of Minerva, BC. She leads a team of talented change makers who are dedicated to advancing the leadership of women and girls. After 15 years developing her expertise in leadership, career development, adult learning, HR, and communications, she joined Minerva, BC as the program's director and assumed the role of CEO in October of 2017. Ruth Mojeed is the founder and chief equity officer of the Inclusion Project. She brings extensive lived experience and grounded expertise to her work in racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. Her research and solutions design focus on an intersectional and intergenerational approach to address complex issues of race, decolonization, and gender equity. Jody Rechenmacher is a consultant and principal with Urban Systems Limited and the board chair with Urban Matters CCC. She works alongside local governments, First Nations, and community organizations on initiatives that improve public service delivery, community sustainability, and civic health. And I have to add this, she's currently working on what feels like a master's degree in patience, creativity, and compassion, i.e. she is on maternity leave and caring for her baby and a preschooler and is preparing to turn to work in January. Sylvia Fuller is a professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia and academic director of the British Columbia Research Data Center Network. Her work explores the dark side of labor markets, inequality and insecurity. She is currently collaborating on a multi-partner project on Canadian work-family policies that includes research on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, Manpreet Dhillon is the founder and CEO of VEZA and an entrepreneur in residence with the Women's Enterprise Center. VEZA has worked with notable organizations, including the UN affiliate organizations for the prohibition of chemical weapons, UN Women, University of British Columbia, HR Tech, Immigrant Employers Council of BC, Terra Mera, as well as a host of tech and biotech companies and non-profit organizations. As I said, a true brain trust. So when I begin, I'm going to begin with a few questions for our panelists, and just over halfway through, I'll ask attendees to submit their questions in the Zoom Q&A. The session is being recorded, and if you could submit your question anonymously if you prefer, or let us know who you are. Attendees, please use the chat to interact, and if possible, please use the Zoom chat and Zoom Q&A. The production team will monitor the VEZA chat and Q&A for those joining us through the app. If you're posting your takeaways to social media, please use the hashtag Rising Economy Week 2020. I'm going to begin the discussion and direct some questions to the panelists. And where possible, if you can make your answers to 2 or 3 minutes, sometimes that won't be possible, I don't think. So the first question is to Sylvia. What exactly do we mean by a she-cession? How does this recession differ from recessions past? And how are Canadian women being affected?
So if we look historically at some of the major recessions that we've had in the past, what has happened is that men have been hit a little bit harder by those recessions, at least initially, than have women. And women have in turn sort of led the recovery, often because women are stepping in and they're taking maybe not the best jobs, but whatever jobs are available to help stabilize family income in light of men's job losses. Now, what's happened, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic is that that has flipped a little bit. So especially with those initial job losses, when everything was shutting down in the spring, all of those front in-person service jobs, front-facing jobs, those are jobs that were dominated by women. So women were really hit hardest, especially in the initial waves of the pandemic. Men did sort of start to catch up with some of those job losses, but they've also recovered faster over time. So what we have is, when we look at the sort of latest data, and Armin Yelnitsky and The Economist has looked at this sort of as of September, so not quite the latest, but close to the end, is that when we think about those jobs that are still missing compared to February numbers, women's jobs account for 85% of those jobs. So that's women's employment losses have been greater than men's in this recession, which is why she's coined the term, or been promoting the use of the term she-cession. And we see this both with sort of employees, but also with entrepreneurs. So women entrepreneurs have also been hit harder by the pandemic. They are more likely to have had a drastic decline in ownership, so going out of business, in the aggregate work hours that are happening, and reporting declines of revenues of more than 20%. That's disproportionately women being hit in the small business sector as well.
Does anybody else want to address that question on the panel? Okay, super. Thank you very much, Sylvia. The next question I have is for Manpreet. Why are we seeing a disproportionate impact on women? How are these impacts compounded by newcomer women, women with children, and women of color? And I don't ask you that for the obvious reason. I just looked at your bio and thought that you'd answer it well.
No, it's totally fine. I can answer for the obvious reason too, because for at Women's Enterprise Center, I'm actually focused on immigrant women in my role there. And obviously have been working with women of color for the last 15 years as well. We're finding that, I mean, a lot of these jobs that they were holding, as we mentioned, were frontline staff, and those were impacted as well. But when we're adding in the cultural impacts of like where the traditional household roles are, we're finding that women are the ones who are kind of choosing to see how is that going to be impacted if they can go to work or not. And then when we add in the cultures of like certain society, like certain ethnic groups and those kind of things as well, the women are already proportionally out of the workforce, and then now you're adding in another layer of why they shouldn't be in the workforce. And when we are thinking about, it's when we already knew that they were making much lower money than their counterparts, and then also their income levels, even as entrepreneurs, were much lower as well. And now you're adding in the fact that revenues have been decreased. They have to make a choice at some level of like, do they continue or not? And when a lot of the immigrant women that we kind of talk to or support are in service level industries, and they were most impacted obviously during pandemic, and they had to make those decisions to just go get those jobs, or if they could get a job, or just shut down their businesses as well and just take care of their children as well. So there are a lot of different factors adding that so to look at here.
Thanks, Manpreet. Very complicated for sure. Tina, as we can, oh, Sylvia, did you want to answer that as well?
Yeah, I thought I would jump in just a little bit there because this is actually something that I've been tracking along with my colleague Yue Chen, also at UBC, and we've been looking specifically at parents. So the growing gender gap in employment among parents in the wake of the pandemic, and we sort of initially looked at the very initial first few months of the pandemic, but we've since updated our analysis, and we'll be submitting that for publication soon, up to the most recent numbers. And so what we saw with this is that certainly women as a whole have been impacted more greatly, but it's particularly the case for parents of kids who are too young to look after themselves. And that really highlights what Manpreet was saying about the importance of these gendered ideas about caregiving. So you have, differences in financial resources in the household. So when you don't have those caregiving options that are available, you might just rationally think that, okay, well, the lower earner is going to be the one who's going to have to step back to fill that gap. But you also have gendered ideas about whose responsibility should that be, who is really the one who's most suited to doing that. So we really saw, and we looked at parents who sort of had been employed within the last year, and we saw this real opening up of an employment gap among parents. So at the peak, it grew by 7 percentage points compared to February for parents of 6 to 12-year-olds, and by 5 percentage points among parents of kids under 6. Now, the good news is that some of those gaps have since declined somewhat, particularly for more educated parents. They have been able to close the gap more than folks with less education, partly because they're able to work from home more easily and things like that. But schools reopening made a big difference in reducing those gaps for parents of school-aged kids in particular. And they've also reduced to some extent for parents with little kids. So this really speaks to the importance, I think, of what are our caregiving arrangements. And when those go away, and we can think about as we enter into the next phase here, the next wave and schools are starting to close again, what is the plan there? How do we manage that? Because without a real solid caregiving infrastructure, what happens is it ends up on the shoulders of mothers. And so that's part of why we're really seeing that disproportionate impact, especially for less advantaged mothers in the labor force who are less able to kind of manage that and juggle that from working at home.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you very much. Okay, Tina, as we continue to navigate the pandemic, what can employers do to support female employees?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I think there's a few things employers can do. Number one is make sure that women are at the table when decisions are being made. We know that women are underrepresented already in leadership. And so if you're making decisions about HR, whether that's reducing employees, whether that's bringing employees back, whether that's flexible work from home, all those kind of arrangements, make sure you have the voices of your female employees, your women identified, your gender diverse employees at the table so that you're accommodating their perspectives. I'd also say reviewing policies and benefits. So we know that mental health is also an emerging issue for many, many people, but certainly women with the additional caregiving responsibilities on top of work, we are seeing greater effects for women. And so thinking about how can you support with benefits, how can you engage employee networks and groups to kind of build up and ensure the resilience of your workplace can be fostered. And then finally, I think investing in women. So investing in your women employees, looking at what are they taking on, what are they doing differently, looking at their roles, looking at how to support them in doing their roles. We've seen a lot of women in our leadership program actually stepping up and taking on greater responsibilities at work. So as employee numbers are shifting, we see women who are stepping up even bigger. So ensuring that they're equipped to do the work and investing in women, that when you look at supply chain, when you look at your vendors, can you redirect funds into local women-owned, women-run businesses to ensure that you're really thinking about how can you support women at all stages and interactions with your business?
Thank you, Tina. Great answer. Great answer indeed. So I'm looking for everybody's mute button. Okay. Jody, when it comes to government stimulus programs at various levels, how can these be changed or directed to get women back into the workforce in the short to medium term?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I am not somebody who has done the academic research or collected the data on this. I'm really speaking from my own perspective as a partner, as an employee. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. I think I've been really impressed with the ability of, particularly our local governments, but also our provincial and federal governments to be testing new approaches in this time, testing pop-up patios, et cetera, those kinds of things, just piloting things. And I think there's a real opportunity to test out new approaches to child and elder care, to bring together the stakeholders who can create some change in those spaces, who have the inside knowledge of what is working, what's not working, and ask them what we could test out. So just using this as a time to pilot some things, because we don't have very much to lose at this point. I think another thing is that it's a real opportunity for governments to recognize that our social infrastructure is as critical as our physical infrastructure. And I'm saying this as an engineer, as a civil engineer. I've built my career on physical infrastructure, but the social infrastructure is really just as important. And so actually, as in my practice, I work a lot on asset management, the care of physical infrastructure. And I think there's actually a real opportunity to apply some similar thinking to our social infrastructure. So developing a better understanding of what social infrastructure we have in place, what is contributing to the quality of life in our communities, rather than just expecting it to be there, understanding the risks and the opportunities to improving or enhancing that social infrastructure, and then investing in ways to improve it and strengthen the resilience of that infrastructure.
Another great answer. It's showing like opportunity. We can pivot to make opportunities. For sure. Tina?
I just wanted to build on that. I've heard that described as thinking about it as feminist focused shovel-ready projects. So we think about what Sylvia was saying in terms of how previous recessions were male-focused, and big dollars were sort of spent on those other types of infrastructure projects, shovel-ready projects. What in our social infrastructure is shovel-ready? And I love the idea of piloting and testing. So I just wanted to sort of add to Jody's comment there.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Okay, Ruth, what about long-term? How could the She-cession have a lasting effect on women's economic opportunity? What might be some long-term considerations for community and business leaders to proactively address these issues? Much sort of what we've just been discussing.
Thank you very much, Starr. And it was really, really refreshing to hear some of the perspectives that the speakers have shared. But I wanted to take us to a place of data, but maybe not data in the strict sense of numbers and figures and aggregation of all of those numbers, but instead to the stories that are behind us. If there's anything that 2020 has taught us, like we're dealing with the pandemic on the one hand, or seeing some of the movements with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and the chant of the clamor for shift in structures, age-long structures and systemic issues and things like that, it just really calls a lot of attention to how much we've not been paying attention to the data, how much we've not been paying attention to who's not represented at the table. I heard Tina say earlier, talking about women and gender diverse people as having them at the decision-making table, to have them be part of determining whatever direction we want to go, whether as corporate leaders, as community, as policymaker, whatever sector we want to come at it from. There's a need to look again at the data. Talking again about some of the ramifications and the long-standing issues. I think the reason this pandemic in particular is quite unique is because very much unlike what we saw in 2008, where it was mostly the men that were impacted, the sectors that are impacted this time around, the service sector, hospitality, retail, and all of that, these are places where you find not just women, but more often than not, racialized women. Because there's a disproportionate representation to where you find Black women, Indigenous women, women of color more broadly represented in those lower paying jobs. When we're talking about the intersectional repercussions of these age-long issues, except we start to pay more attention to how do we invite them to be to the table and be part of determining the solutions for the next steps? We just keep perpetuating the same cycle.
Thank you, Ruth. And we seem to be so inclusive as women at any rate, it makes perfect sense that that should have been happening for decades now, in my opinion. But Jody?
Yeah, something I just wanted to add, and something I've been a little bit concerned about with my own firm is over the long term. So myself, I'm looking at returning to work in January and questioning. So I'm certainly going back to work, so I'm not stepping out of work, but I'm questioning at what % I can go back to work. I don't know if full-time is an option for me due to family circumstances, et cetera. And I've seen that from a number of other women in our firm. So it's women who have leadership roles, who are really hitting the stride of their career, and they're stepping back. And so they're not fully stepping out, but they're reducing what they're able to contribute. And I'm concerned because, well, for a couple of reasons. One is that the women who, in my view, who are often playing that critical care role at home are playing a similar critical care role in our workplace. And so and that's often a background role. It's not so visible. And I'm worried about the longer term repercussions for our teams and our people within our business. So how is that going to affect our business? How is that going to affect everyone? But then also, how is it going to affect women who are just entering the workplace, who are losing the accessibility of other women leaders and mentors to look up to and to kind of help guide them through developing their career and through some of the trickier times. So I think there's both a concern for our business as well as for developing women. What longer impact is that going to have?
Jody, great points for sure. I'm going to go to Manpreet and then Sylvia, if that's okay.
Yeah, I just want to add to that because it's these issues have always been there. These issues aren't new. Like, I mean, thinking about, I go back to like 2012 when I started doing work looking at women of color. I call them women of culturally diverse backgrounds because culture influences all of us in different ways. And I started doing this work in 2012. And at that time I was told, well, no, it's a women's issue, don't add the race side into that. And now all of a sudden, 8 years later, all the work I've been talking about for the last 8 years matters. But I'm like, the problem was always there, but it was just we weren't paying attention to it at that time. And now that we're paying attention to it, all these issues have, again, showing, like, as Ruth mentioned, we're just showing the vulnerabilities of society that have always existed. Either we didn't have the data and now we actually have the data in place. And in some cases, we still don't have the data. When we look at even healthcare, and we're not looking at, we're not always measuring all of the racialized components within healthcare either, and looking at how that's impacting us as well. So, I mean, I'm so glad we're having these conversations, but it's also, as me and Tina have had this conversation many times, it's a little bit exhausting as well, because the conversation hasn't been any different over the last so many years. The numbers are slightly better than they used to be, but where this change has to be, and creating systemic change within organizations and communities, and really looking at the mentorship opportunities, but also looking at what are the processes and systems that organizations need to have in place to ensure that there's equality and equity at all levels of the organization. And until we start doing that actually with a true lens, we're not going to see the change happening.
Thank you very much, Manpreet, very much indeed. Sylvia.
So there's a lot to pick up on in these comments. I'm not quite sure where to start, but I think I want to pick up on one thing that Jody said in talking about sort of, the dilemmas of, coming back from leave and thinking about, what is the future going to look like for you and can you manage it? And part of the problem is that, we have framed this in North America as about women's adaptations, women's choices, women stepping back or opting out or scaling back, or however you want to frame it. And organizations have also responded in terms of very sort of gendered ideas about what they're doing, so that when there are organizations who are implementing policies around job sharing, around flexibility and so forth, it's often done so in a way that is gendered. It's whether that's formally or more often just implicitly, right? This is seen as something for women and for mothers. And the problem with that is that that tends to lead to stigmatization of people who take advantage of that. It leads to sidelining of women's careers, and it contributes to gender inequity. So what we need to be thinking about is, why are these jobs organized in the first place in a way that makes them incompatible with care responsibilities? And rather than thinking about how do we change the job so that, mothers or women with care responsibilities can manage them in some reduced or limited or changed capacity, how do we actually encourage men to be also working in these ways? How can we change work so that it's more flexible and more sustainable and more adaptable to everybody? And where you have changes in organizations that are not framed in gendered ways, that are framed as being about, greater enhancing productivity, flexibility, and so forth for everyone, you tend to have better outcomes in that response. There's a wonderful recent book that just came out this year by Phyllis Moan and Ehren Kelly called Overload, that I highly recommend. It's based on a really long and very deep, intensive research on this topic. So I think we need to really think about and I know from my own research that when work is organized in ways that are more flexible, among those who have flexible work, motherhood wage penalties are smaller. Among those who are able to work from home, sometimes motherhood wage penalties are smaller. So the pandemic provides us an opportunity. We have had this external shock that has really changed the way work has been done, and that has allowed a lot of organizations to move away from these assumptions about face time to be more flexible in how work is organized. So I think the challenge is, how do we build on that? How do we learn from that? But do so in a way that is changing work for everybody to make it more sustainable. So it's not just seen as something that is for women or for mothers, because that is the pathway to marginalization and inequality.
And I'll just add to that, like, remembering that there's single fathers out there too, and there's when we're talking about single parents, like, where it's remembering them as well, because there's a lot of, there's so many challenges that exist there as well.
Yeah, this is such a great conversation. I'd like to carry it on all day. Ruth.
Yes, no, I just to add to something that I heard from, again, Sylvia earlier, and talking about some of the ways that people are building resiliency and trying to make a way for themselves, especially within the racialized community. I'm talking about entrepreneurship. And that's in part because the labor market is really capitally, the forms of discrimination that we see that is highly gendered and highly racialized, but also by nature, systemic racism and discrimination and whatever factors we want to consider in that mix have also historically excluded certain groups. So for instance, racialized women are looking at how do I respond to this in terms of access to childcare? How do I build around something that works for me and my growing family and caregiving needs? And then you go to the financial institutions, and there are tons of hoops and barriers that you have to go through just to be able to access some of this support. And it's not like you're ever successful. It's not like you're truly successful in every instance. And so just all of that speaking to some of the compounding issues that people have to face as they're looking for ways out of this, as they're thinking about the she recovery or the she-covery, maybe not in those terms, but as those efforts are coming together, there are still frustrations. There are still huge gaps within the systems that are not supporting that.
And if I could just jump in for 1 second there too. I think that if we think about sort of, racialized women entrepreneurs, they're more often in the industries that have been halted as a result of the pandemic, right? So retail, hospitality, service. This is where racialized women's entrepreneurship has tended to be, right? So there's a disproportionate impact for there. And I think the other thing that we also need to really keep in mind, we haven't had great data on the racialized impact of the pandemic, in part because historically, the labor force survey, which is our main source of information on, on timely labor market information, hasn't even asked about racialization. They have added that, but it's not in the public use data files yet. So most of us who are working with this data don't even have that information. But there have been a few, initial studies that have come out that have shown that, okay, well, we're maybe not seeing as huge differences among employees along immigration status or racialization in terms of job loss, but the consequences of those job loss are going to be more pronounced for racialized people because they're in a more precarious financial situation to start with. There tends to be less generational wealth. There tend to be in lower paying jobs because of discrimination in the labor market and various other barriers, certainly capitalization, discrimination in capital markets for entrepreneurs. So when you have a job loss, right, people in non-white groups, people of color, are less able to weather that because they're less able to have the reserves, right? So that really, again, speaks to thinking about all the different ways that, you know, systemic racism really can have an impact. Even if you don't see a difference in job loss, the consequences are going to be felt in a really different way. And so that speaks again to the importance of our social infrastructure and how are we buffering people, and is it adequate when we're thinking about trying to recover from this pandemic, and who's going to need the most help.
Great conversation, just so exciting. I would like to go to the Q&A because I think there's going to be some great questions here. Let's go to, okay. So this is from Andre Gordon. Well, it's from the event team. This is apparently an anonymous question. I recently did a survey looking at older women's experience in the workplace where nearly 100 women responded. White men predominantly had companies without women and without color represented in upper management. Incoming employees can't mentor up. Of the women who responded, many are incredibly experienced, and in spite of applying to hundreds of jobs, they can't find work. You can't be what you can't see. What can we do to allow for aging and physical diversity in the workplace? So I would say I'm going to go to Ruth first.
Absolutely. So I'm not super sure what they meant by physical diversity. I want to take that as representation more broadly. I really like that quote on you can't be what you can't see. And that speaks to, again, representation. I would speak from my own personal experience coming here from, I'm from Nigeria originally and moving here about 5 years ago. And one of the questions that I really started to ask earlier on in my own journey, in my development as a career person, was how come there are no people that look like me in positions of leadership, whether it's in policy making, in corporate institutions and things like that. And soon enough, I started to find, I saw that same question. I heard it echoed through the experiences or the views of other people who were like me. I want to say, so we're moving the needle. Some of that is shifting a little bit as organizations are becoming more and more aware of the need for true inclusion or for representation, and then working towards true inclusion. I mean, just going to how we work with organizations, part of what we do is we support equity, diversity, and inclusion. We do process development and systemic change. And in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw a rush of organizations coming to us talking about, we're not even sure where to start from. We're not even sure how we got here. And then for us is you start by looking at the numbers again. Who's not in the room? You look at the services that you're delivering, and we take you to that place of imagining if this was a world where different perspectives, different experiences, different worldviews are empowered and affirmed and reflected in the workplace, how much better could things be? And just going that journey with different stakeholder groups, we've seen some level of improvement. We've seen some levels of changes. But yeah, it starts from that critical place of stepping back a little bit and asking what are some of the existing long-term, long-standing historical issues that have brought us here, and what do we need to do? That change, by nature, systems are very resistant. They can be very, very resistant. So that change that we're asking organizations to do is not something that will come easy. It's not something you do by the snap of a finger or something you do by just attending a session like this. This could very well be checkboxing. And there is solid harm in that. But there's a need, there's a space within the challenge for within whatever challenge, lack of representation, there's also an opportunity for us to see where do we go to find this talent? Who should we be talking to? Who are the experts? Who are the people with the lived experience to help us move things forward?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruth. I'm going to go to Tina and then Manpreet.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. When we think about women in the workplace, we know that there's bias and discrimination. If we think about racialized folks, there's bias and discrimination. If we think about people who are older, there's bias and discrimination. That's sort of baked into our culture and our society, that we have preferences. And, you know, as welcoming and inclusive and good people that we want to be, those biases are inherent, they're implicit, they happen sort of behind the scenes before us knowing. So we have to think about, if you're trying to diversify workforce, where are those intersecting identities that are compounding discrimination for folks? So if you think about a woman and then you think about an older woman, she is going to face double discrimination in the workplace. So they are going to be missing, and there are going to be gaps. And for organizations and individuals, part of that is becoming aware of the biases that you hold, and then not trying to debias yourself as an individual, although there's lots of great ways that you can become a better human. We have to look at debiasing systems and processes and policies. So how can you minimize the effect of that inherent bias that we can't train ourselves out of, by having open conversation, by having, you know, very consistent ways that you onboard and that you engage people, and that you really try to figure out, well, what's getting in the way of us hiring these groups or these individuals who are not reflected in our workforce, and recognizing that there's both a financial benefit in terms of you know, better financial performance for diversity, as well as evidence increasingly showing that there's a multiplier for innovation. So diversity is stronger and stronger, the business case is there. So it's then sort of dialing back to see, well, what's going on in our organization that's preventing these individuals from being successful, and how can we change that?
Great. Thank you so much, Tina. Manpreet?
Not just to add to that, like just even thinking about people with disabilities and or else with diverse abilities, and also older, you know, older individuals. I look back even at my own household. Like my parents they're not that old, but they're, you know, and when I'm even during this pandemic of getting them access to information, getting them access to their networks, and having to teach them Zoom, having the, you know, and we work with a lot of immigrant organizations, and a lot of even the staff at some of the immigrant organizations are like, you know, we're like, one of the biggest challenges was training the staff who work at the organizations on using technology in a way that would help them deal with the clients. And then if the staff doesn't know, then the clients aren't getting access, and the clients don't have the technology capabilities to access the services that are available for them. And so we're kind of missing that. That's actually one of the biggest things that we're missing in part of, you know, the whole pandemic as well. There's a whole group of slew of individuals who don't have access to reliable internet, or don't have the computer still, and who don't know how to use them either. And when we start thinking about, you know, yes, like those are the groups that are impacted most by the pandemic. Like, what are we doing to support them? Yeah, the funding's there to upskill them, reskill them, or whatever else. But unless they can access to know that the funding is there or that programs exist, they're not going to be able to access them either. And if the staff in organizations isn't able to use the computers or even interact with like clients to tell them about these programs, we're not changing the situation either there. So it's, I mean, again, another layer of it, but it's also, let's think about the technology needs. I mean, that it goes back to a lot of that. A lot of the reasons why, even for myself, I'm like early 40s, I'm already like, I had to call one of my team members. How do I take a screenshot? Like it was, you know, like basic things, but it's, but we're a little bit behind. We're starting to be a little bit behind even in technology and how we use it. So it kind of, you think about your own age, like the ageism restrictions that start to show up as well, right?
Yeah, great comments. Really, really great. I'm going to just go to the questions, the Q&A here. Okay. I see. Let's go to Emily. We've all heard of the achievement gap in schools. Breaks or deficiencies in early education and primary leads to long-term achievement gaps that are very difficult to overcome. Is this something systematic we should be worried about now, with women downsizing or exiting the workplace altogether to handle the pressures of home life under the pandemic? Okay, Sylvia, please.
Yeah, I can speak to that. Certainly, if we think about, you know, the research that we have quite a lot of research on mothers and the ways in which they're disadvantaged in the labor market. But some earlier research that I did was looking at that wage gap between mothers and childless women. And the gap is largest when mothers are changing employers after their mothers. So basically, a lot of what's driving it is not necessarily differences within an organization, but that mothers are more likely to work for organizations that pay everybody relatively poorly. So they're sorted into lower paying firms. And this is also happens for gender in general. Women work for all else equal lower paying firms that pay everybody worse. And where we really see that most dramatically is where there's been a break in employment. So not being able to go back to your same employer after you've had a break, some time out of the labor market, taking care of your kids or what have you, and having to re-enter the labor market at that stage really has a long-lasting impact on women's earnings. So with the pandemic, right, we have this whole cohort of women who have potentially, lost jobs at higher rates and are being forced to have to go back on the labor market. And so when you go onto that labor market at the hiring stage, that's often where the opportunities for discrimination of various sorts are the highest, right? Because employers have the less individual information about you and your performance and who you are and what your circumstances are. So in that context, they're more likely to rely upon biases and stereotypes. So we know that that disadvantages mothers. So to the extent that we have more mothers who are, stepping back, taking a break, losing their jobs, that's going to potentially magnify that even more because it also reinforces those biases that it's mothers that are doing it. But also we're going to see that with more racialized women, women with disabilities, anybody who faces discrimination in the labor market at the point of hire is where that can be really come to the fore. So it is definitely concerning, and this is one of those things that we'll have to see how this plays out over time, right? So the longer that this goes on, the more women are sort of, being pushed out of the labor market, whether it's because of job loss or because they're having to step back because they don't have other care arrangements, the more you see problems. So the good news that we saw was that with the schools reopening, with daycares reopening, although a lot of them are in very precarious financial position and they haven't all reopened, we have seen some of those gaps diminish, which I think is really, that's the good news, right? But as we head into the second wave and as we're starting to see school closures again, with very little backup plans, did we learn nothing from the spring, frankly, right? It boggles my mind, frankly, right? So that's more of a concern, and you also have more people who are hitting their breaking point, trying to manage everything together, and as it goes on and on, can they manage it? So hopefully we'll have a vaccine. There's a light at the end of the tunnel that maybe people will be able to sort of hang on because of that. But I do really worry with the second wave that we're gonna compound those effects, and we know that when you have that break, when you lose that connection with your employer, it really has potentially long-lasting negative impacts on people's careers.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sylvia, and Tina. I see you want to comment as well.
Yeah, I just want to add something in here that we haven't really talked about yet, but it's about childcare, and it's about childcare disappearing. So when we think about all these effects and we think about women coming back, I read a great article that said, imagine in 5 years that you want to have childcare and you want to have camp for your kids and you want to have these things in place, but not because of the effect of the pandemic and social distancing, but because of the effect of the economic downturn and the closures. And we are right now at risk of losing a lot of childcare spaces in our country because of the restrictions, because of the cost, because of the safety protocols. Lots of small home-based daycares are closing because they can't manage sort of the new protocols. And so childcare spaces are disappearing. So not only do we have women who may be taking time out, who want to come back eventually, who will then face sort of those barriers and discriminations in the labor market, not to mention their own confidence about potentially being out of the workforce, but then the infrastructure may not be there to even support them returning to work. And so that's also a compounding factor that we have to be mindful of, is that we are losing some of our existing social infrastructure, which already is not accessible, consistent, or affordable enough to meet the current demands and the needs of our working population.
As much as it sounds that there's some great opportunities here for relooking at our business models, and there is a lot of fear factors happening here as well. Yeah, for sure.
Oh, you muted yourself, Starr. Starr, you're muted there.
I do it every day, at least 3 times a day. Thank you very much, Tina. Okay, so it looks like, let's see here.
Can I just make a
what-
comment on the childcare really quickly?
Oh, please, sorry, I didn't.
No worries. I'm just going to give a shout out to Pacific Immigrant Resources Society. They're looking at mobile childcare, and they actually had a model set up, and they're looking at how to implement that more with immigrant women providing childcare in different spaces in the Lower Mainland. So for those of you who have access to Lower Mainland, that might be an idea and something hopefully they can expand out to the island as well.
Thank you. Thank you for sending some opportunities our way. That's a great thing. And I think we need to have as much information along that as we can get. So this is from Dallas. What, if any, might be some of the positive outcomes over the medium to long term of the pandemic? Do you think our societal values will shift in a way that contributes positively to increased participation of women in the workforce or in leadership roles? Anybody want to answer that?
I would love to answer that question. I love talking about that question.
Okay, great, man.
So for years, one of the reasons why I started doing the work I did, because I was so tired of the masculine corporate systems that we have, where everything's focused on go, go, go. And it's like, and there's so many women burning out, leaving the workplace, and everything that else looks like I burnt out as well. And so for me, when we're bringing in these feminine leadership principles, not about gendered principles, but the feminine leadership principles, looking at empathy, looking at relationships, looking at collaboration, community, what does that look like, and how does that translate back into the workplace? I think that's actually how we can change society. And I think this is a great opportunity it kind of just sped forward all of these principles that we've been trying to work on and trying to like break apart. And I think we have this great opportunity this time to really see that how important those principles are and how important that balance is for people's well-being, and how we build communities from that, and how that actually supports our economy, and how it's actually better for our economy as well. So it's I think that's actually going to be one of the greatest highlights that I'm looking forward to seeing from this pandemic.
Lovely, thanks, Manpreet. Jody, and then Ruth, and then Tina.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Manpreet. I couldn't agree more. I think that is super important, and I think that is also how we get more women in leadership roles in our firms. One other thing that is more of I call it a logistical thing with the pandemic. I think working from home is kind of a double-edged sword, really. There are lots of challenges, but there are also a lot of benefits. And I think, so I'm very privileged to be working in an organization where there was already the flexibility to work from home, but there were also a lot of perceived risks and dangers from working from home. So it still wasn't an option that people would embrace very often. And I've talked to a number of colleagues who feel like actually being able to work from home has been a godsend in helping them to manage the various stressors that the pandemic places on them, and that they can build the flexibility into their day in a way that makes a lot more sense for them. And I know even for myself, returning to work, it makes a difference not having a commute to do every single day. And so I guess that's just also a caution that I'd put out when we can all safely return to work. Let's do so in a way that's thoughtful and not just jump back to assuming that everything needs to be in person and that we all need to be in a physical environment together. Let's try and take some of what we've learned about working from home.
Thank you, Jody. This is a good question to end on. I think it's going to be Ruth and then Tina.
Absolutely. I think I just really want to take it back again to sort of where I started from. But first, in answering that question succinctly, I think there is a lot of opportunities in this pandemic for us to rebuild and for us to rethink and reimagine work. I mean, before the pandemic, if anyone had prophesied to any of us that we're going to be working from our own isolated spaces and still trying to be effective and just doing life, we probably would have wanted to push that as futuristic thinking or something, but we're doing it. We're here. We're thriving. We're talking about some of the challenges, and we probably will keep talking about them until something is done about them. But more so, we're seeing many more people put their hands up and say, these are some of the solutions that I'm thinking around. Manpreet, thank you very much for sharing about the organization that is doing this work around looking at innovation in childcare support and things like that. So I think there is that opportunity for innovativeness as we move along. But again, going to that place of collecting, looking at the data again, I'm not talking about the full-on data. It's breaking it down, and for each of us getting this chance to just pause and to see who's not represented here. Once we start to do that, I think then we can really start to reap the full benefits of what opportunities or challenges this pandemic has presented us.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Tina?
Great, and I'll just end. So Minerva is an organization dedicated to advancing the leadership of girls and women, and there is no ambition gap around leadership. Girls and women want to lead, they want to step up, and there's great research coming out of the US that's looking at Black and Latinx girls and how they show the highest sort of desire to lead, and also supportive parents who see themselves as leaders. So one of the things that I feel super optimistic about the pandemic is that we've seen exceptional women leaders. We've seen women rise to the challenge, and it's not because they are inherently better at managing crisis than men or better leaders than men. It's because they have had opportunity to show a style to the world that we don't often see. We've been able to see women leaders being participatory, being consultative, being empathetic. So if we think about Hong Kong and Taiwan and Germany and New Zealand and how these global leaders have stepped up, and even locally here in BC, Bonnie Henry, just really leading how they lead and in the best way possible, and that they are being successful, but the style isn't necessarily sort of embedded in some of those male stereotypes and those typical things that we tend to see. And I'll just leave by sort of, inspiring us to think about, globally, gender equality has not been reached in any country. Only 7% of global leaders are women. And so we are basically rejecting almost 50% of our talent, right? 50% of our potential and our talent in leadership roles. So how can we flip that? And I think the examples we've seen through the pandemic of women leading and leading successfully sort of begs the question of how do we make more room at the table for different styles, different approaches, different voices, so that we can have the benefit of all of that talent.
Wonderful. Tina and Sylvia, you're going to wrap us up as far as the panelists speaking, so please.
Sure. And I think the flip side of that is also men and what men are doing, right? And certainly something that, many of us have argued for many years based on the data is that, we need to have men more involved on the home front and the caring if we want to have women's equality in the labor market, right? These two are entwined, they're not separate things. And so I don't want to be too Pollyanna-ish about this. We do have some information coming out about what's happening on the home front with men's caring in the pandemic. And for the most part, we're not seeing huge shifts, but where there is change, it is inching towards greater equality. So both men and women are reporting that men are somewhat more involved in domestic work than they were before. And so we know as well from research on parental leave that when men take that responsibility, when they're more involved, it can actually have long-lasting implications. So years later, they're still more involved with their kids. They're doing more housework. There's lots of impacts that actually go beyond just that one particular moment in time. So we're in a moment in time. There have been some shifts. Some men have been, thrust into roles that are more new for them. Their wives might be, or their partners, if they're in heterosexual relationships, might be essential workers. So they're off out of the labor market, and they're the ones home with the kids managing it in this care deficit. And so that does provide also the opportunity and the possibility for not just change in this immediate crisis, but for longer lasting shifts as well. So that's another place where I think that we can possibly see some positive implications over the longer term.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. And thank you, everybody. It's wonderful. I am a glass half full kind of a person, so probably as a moderator, I'm going to come across and say that what I'm hearing is there's opportunities to rebuild and reimagine and rethink, and that it's so important. I've run many businesses, and we need to get the diversity at the table making the decisions. I heard that loud and clear. And it's just been an honor to moderate this panel. You are, all of you, really something. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to say that in lieu of gifts, we're going to be supporting local businesses through Support Local BC. I'd like to thank Urban Systems for supporting the important conversation. Thanks to RBC and Western Diversification Canada for supporting the Rising Economy Week. Thank you for the SIP. I mean, let's face it, without them, we wouldn't be here. And I just want to thank you again. It's been an honor. Thank you.